In the middle of the 8th century, far from the famous capitals of China or the great cities of the Islamic world, two empires collided in a remote river valley. Why did a battle fought in what is now Central Asia matter more than many larger, bloodier wars? How did a single clash between armies help change the way human knowledge was recorded, preserved, and shared? And how did a military confrontation quietly reshape global civilization without most people even noticing at the time? In this video, I'm going to discuss all of this, how it began, what happened, and how it changed the world. So without any delay, let's start. Long before the Battle of Talas, Central Asia was already one of the most important crossroads on Earth. For centuries, caravans had moved across its deserts, mountains, and river valleys, carrying silk, spices, horses, precious metals, and ideas. This vast network, later known as the Silk Road, connected China to the Middle East, Africa, and Europe. But trade routes do not exist in isolation. Wherever wealth and movement flow, power follows. By the early 8th century, two expanding civilizations were pushing steadily toward each other along these routes: the Tang dynasty of China from the east and the Abbasid Caliphate from the west. The Tang dynasty represented one of China's greatest imperial peaks. Its armies were professional, disciplined, and confident, having expanded Chinese influence deep into Central Asia. Chinese control did not always mean direct rule, but it involved protectorates, garrisons, alliances with local kingdoms, and political pressure. The Tang court viewed Central Asia not only as a trade corridor, but as a strategic buffer zone that protected China's western frontier. Losing influence there meant exposing the empire to threats from nomadic confederations and rival powers. At the same time, the Islamic world was undergoing its own dramatic transformation. The Umayyad Caliphate had already spread Islam from Arabia across North Africa and into Central Asia, but internal conflict weakened its grip. In 750 CE, the Abbasids overthrew the Umayyads and established a new caliphate with its center in Mesopotamia. Unlike their predecessors, the Abbasids were deeply interested in administration, learning, and long-term governance. They inherited not only vast territories, but also unresolved frontiers, including the volatile regions of Transoxiana, the land beyond the Oxus River. Between these two empires lay a mosaic of local powers: Turkic tribes, Sogdian city-states, and smaller kingdoms that had learned to survive by balancing loyalties. Some paid tribute to China, others aligned with Muslim governors, and many switched sides when it suited their interests. These groups were not passive bystanders. They played a crucial role in shaping events, often manipulating larger empires to preserve autonomy or gain advantage over rivals. Tension between the Tang dynasty and the expanding Islamic world did not erupt overnight. It built slowly through diplomatic rivalries, border disputes, and competition for influence over key cities. One such city was Tashkent, an important regional hub. When internal conflicts there escalated, both Chinese and Abbasid-aligned forces became involved, each backing different factions. What might have remained a local power struggle gradually escalated into a confrontation between two imperial systems that now saw each other as obstacles to their strategic ambitions. The Tang dynasty sent a seasoned general, Gao Shenzi, to reassert Chinese authority in the region. Gao was experienced in Central Asian warfare and understood both the terrain and the political complexity of the area. His campaigns initially went well. Chinese forces advanced westward, defeating local opponents and reinforcing China's reputation as a dominant military power. From the Tang perspective, the situation appeared under control. Their armies were well trained, their supply lines functional, and their confidence high. However, the Abbasids viewed the situation very differently. For them, Chinese expansion threatened the Western Islamic frontier and undermined their authority over newly incorporated territories. More importantly, it challenged their legitimacy among local Muslim populations and allied tribes. Allowing the Tang to dominate Central Asia would not only weaken Abbasid influence, but also disrupt the balance of power along vital trade routes that sustained the caliphate's economy. As a result, the Abbasids prepared for confrontation. They assembled an army composed not only of Arab soldiers, but also Persian forces and Turkic allies, reflecting the multicultural nature of the Islamic world. This diversity was both a strength and a challenge. It allowed the Abbasids to draw on a wide pool of manpower and cavalry expertise, but it also required careful coordination and leadership to maintain unity on the battlefield. The stage was set near the Talas River in what is now modern-day Kyrgyzstan. The location itself reflected the nature of the conflict, remote, rugged, and far removed from imperial capitals, yet strategically crucial. Neither side initially understood how significant this battle would become. To the Tang dynasty, it was another frontier engagement meant to reinforce dominance. To the Abbasids, it was necessary stand to halt eastern expansion and secure their borders. When the two armies met, the confrontation was shaped more than just numbers and weapons. Each side brought different military traditions, tactics, and assumptions. The Tang relied heavily on disciplined infantry formations, supported by cavalry, reflecting centuries of Chinese military evolution. The Abbasid forces emphasized mobility, cavalry charges, and adaptability, traits honed through years of warfare across deserts and steppelands. At first, the battle appeared evenly matched. Both sides fought fiercely, neither gaining a decisive advantage. But beneath the surface, critical factors were already shifting the outcome. One of the most important involved the Turkic Karluk tribes, who were initially aligned with the Tang forces. Their loyalty, however, was not rooted in ideology or empire, but in pragmatic calculations of survival and advantage. As the battle dragged on, the Karluks reassessed the situation. Seeing an opportunity to weaken Chinese influence and align with a rising power, they switched sides mid-battle. This sudden betrayal shattered the Tang army's cohesion. Attacked from the front and rear, Chinese forces found themselves overwhelmed. What had been a controlled engagement quickly turned into chaos. The defeat was devastating for the Tang Expeditionary Force. Gao Shenzi managed to escape, but much of his army was destroyed or captured. For the Abbasids, the victory was significant, but it did not immediately lead to territorial conquest deep into China's sphere. Instead, the outcome reshaped the balance of power in Central Asia. Chinese influence receded, while Islamic authority consolidated its position west of the region. At the time, this might have seemed like a standard outcome of frontier warfare. Empires advance, clash, and retreat. Borders shift, alliances change, and life goes on. But the true significance of the Battle of Talas did not lie in territorial gains or military glory. It lay in something far quieter, far less dramatic, and far more enduring: the transfer of knowledge. Among the Chinese prisoners captured after the battle were artisans skilled in paper making. Paper, though known in China for centuries, was still a rare and closely guarded technology elsewhere. The Abbasids quickly recognized its value. In a world where knowledge was preserved on parchment, papyrus, or stone, paper was cheaper, lighter, and easier to produce at scale. What followed was not an explosion, but a gradual transformation. Paper-making workshops began to appear in Islamic cities, starting in Samarkand and later spreading to Baghdad. This technology would revolutionize administration, education, science, and culture across the Islamic world and eventually beyond. But at Talas, none of this was yet obvious. The battle ended, the armies withdrew, and history quietly turned a page. This is where the story truly begins. In the years following the Battle of Talas, the immediate military consequences seemed limited. The Abbasids did not march eastward toward China, and the Tang dynasty did not collapse overnight. Borders did not dramatically redraw themselves on maps, and no grand imperial capital fell as a direct result of the clash. But beneath the surface, the balance of Central Asia had shifted in a way that would quietly reshape global history. The Tang withdrawal from the region created a power vacuum, and into that vacuum stepped new forces, new cultures, and new systems of knowledge transmission that would ripple outward for centuries. For the Tang dynasty, the defeat at Talas was not just a battlefield loss, it was a warning. Chinese influence in Central Asia had always been expensive to maintain. Supplying armies across vast distances, negotiating with local unpredictable rulers, and managing nomadic alliances required enormous resources. Talas exposed how fragile this system could be when local allies turned against them. The Karluk betrayal was especially damaging, not merely because it caused defeat, but because it demonstrated that Chinese authority in the region rested more on convenience than loyalty. Trust, once broken, was difficult to restore. At almost the same time, the Tang dynasty faced mounting internal pressures. Just a few years after Talas, the An Lushan rebellion erupted, plunging China into one of the most devastating internal conflicts in its history. Millions would die, cities would be destroyed, and imperial authority would be permanently weakened. Faced with rebellion at home, the Tang court had no choice but to abandon most of its Central Asian ambitions. Garrisons were withdrawn, protectorates dissolved, and Chinese influence steadily receded eastward. Talas, in hindsight, was less a cause and more a signal that the era of Chinese dominance in Central Asia was ending. For the Abbasid Caliphate, the outcome was far more favorable. While they did not gain vast new territories directly from the battle, they secured their eastern frontier and strengthened their legitimacy among Central Asian peoples. The victory demonstrated that the Abbasids were not merely inheritors of the Umayyad conquests, but a capable ruling power in their own right. It also reassured local Muslim communities and allied tribes that aligning with the Caliphate offered protection against external empires. Central Asia itself began to change rapidly. With Chinese authority weakened, Islamic influence expanded through trade, settlement, and cultural exchange rather than large-scale conquest. Cities like Samarkand and Bukhara became vibrant centers of Islamic learning, commerce, and administration. Merchants, scholars, and missionaries moved along the Silk Road, carrying not just goods, but religious ideas, languages, and technologies. Islam gradually took root across the region, blending with local customs and traditions. It was in this environment that papermaking quietly took hold. The Chinese artisans captured at Talas were not treated merely as prisoners, they were valuable assets. Their knowledge represented something revolutionary. Paper had existed in China for at least the 2nd century, but outside East Asia, writing materials were expensive and limiting. Papyrus was fragile and regionally restricted. Parchment made from animal skins was durable but costly and labor-intensive. Both imposed natural limits on how much information could be recorded and shared. Paper changed those limits entirely. It was cheaper, lighter, and easier to produce at large quantities. Once the technique was understood and adapted to local materials, papermaking spread quickly. Samarkand became one of the first major centers of paper production outside China. From there, the technology moved westward to Baghdad, the heart of the Abbasid world. This was no coincidence. Baghdad was not just a political capital, it was becoming an intellectual one. The Abbasid caliphs, particularly during the early 9th century, invested heavily in knowledge. They sponsored translations of Greek, Persian, and Indian texts, funded scholars, and established institutions like the House of Wisdom. Paper made this intellectual explosion possible. Books could now be copied in large numbers. Libraries could expand dramatically. Scholars could exchange ideas across distances with unprecedented ease. Administrative records could be kept more efficiently, strengthening governance and taxation. This transformation did not happen overnight, but its effects were cumulative and profound. As paper spread, literacy expanded beyond narrow elites. Knowledge became more mobile, more resilient, and more democratic. Scientific treatises, philosophical works, legal texts, and poetry circulated across the Islamic world, creating a shared intellectual culture that transcended ethnic and regional boundaries. This was one of the foundations of what later historians would call the Islamic Golden Age. Meanwhile, the Silk Road itself evolved. No longer dominated by Chinese imperial power, it became a more fluid network shaped by Muslim merchants, Turkic nomads, and local rulers. Trade intensified, linking East Asia, the Islamic world, and eventually Europe in deeper ways. Along these routes traveled not only goods like silk and spices, but ideas about mathematics, astronomy, medicine, and engineering. Paper was the silent enabler of this exchange, the medium that allowed knowledge to be preserved, studied, and transmitted across generations. Ironically, China itself would eventually benefit from this process. Though papermaking originated there, the expansion of paper-based knowledge systems in the Islamic world and later in Europe would create new centers of innovation that would, centuries later, reconnect with East Asia. But in the 8th and 9th centuries, the immediate beneficiaries were the Abbasids and their cultural sphere. The Battle of Talas thus occupies a strange place in history. It was not one of the largest battles of its time. It did not involve legendary commanders whose names echo through popular memory. It did not redraw maps in dramatic fashion. Yet its consequences were disproportionate to its scale. By altering the balance of power in Central Asia and enabling the spread of papermaking, it helped accelerate a transformation in how humanity recorded and shared knowledge. This raises an important question about how we understand historical change. We often focus on decisive victories, fallen capitals, and dramatic conquests, but Talas reminds us that some of the most important moments in history are quiet ones. Moments where a technology changes hands, where a frontier shifts just enough to allow new ideas to flow, where the long-term impact far outweighs the immediate spectacle. As the opposite world embraced paper, it laid the groundwork for advancements that would eventually reach Europe through Islamic Spain and Sicily. Centuries later, European societies would adopt paper, develop printing, and undergo their own intellectual revolutions. None of that could have happened without the earlier transmission of paper-making knowledge. And while Talas was not the sole factor in that transmission, it was a crucial catalyst. At the same time, the Tang dynasty's retreat from Central Asia marked a turning point in Chinese history. The empire would recover from internal rebellion, but it would never again project power so deeply into the West. China's focus shifted inward and eastward, shaping a different trajectory of development. The world was becoming more interconnected, but also more regionally specialized, with different centers of power rising and falling. What followed the Battle of Talas was not a simple story of one empire replacing another. It was a story of transition, of how political shifts create cultural opportunities, of how warfare, even when limited, can produce consequences far beyond the battlefield, and of how something as unassuming as paper could become one of the most powerful forces in human history. As paper production spread across the Islamic world, its impact began to reshape society in ways that no general at Talas could have predicted. What started as a captured technique slowly became an infrastructure of knowledge. In cities like Baghdad, Damascus, Cairo, and later Cordoba, paper was no longer a novelty. It became the foundation of administration, scholarship, and culture. Governments could issue decrees and keep records more efficiently. Courts could document laws and precedents. Merchants could track contracts and debts. Scholars could write, revise, copy, and debate ideas at a scale previously unimaginable. This transformation coincided perfectly with the Abbasid vision of governance. Unlike earlier empires that relied primarily on conquest, the Abbasids emphasized bureaucracy, taxation, and intellectual legitimacy. Paper empowered all three. It allowed the caliphate to manage its vast territories with written precision rather than oral tradition alone. Tax records, census lists, legal opinions, and correspondence could be stored, copied, and transported quickly. This made the Abbasid state more resilient and more centralized, even as it governed a culturally diverse population. The cultural consequences were even greater. The Islamic world had already inherited rich intellectual traditions from Persia, India, and the remnants of Greek civilization. What paper did was remove the bottleneck that had limited access to this knowledge. Translation movements flourished. Greek works on philosophy, medicine, and mathematics were translated into Arabic. Indian numerical systems were studied and adapted. Persian administrative texts influenced governance. Because paper was affordable, these texts did not remain confined to loyal libraries. They circulated among scholars, students, and officials, creating a shared intellectual ecosystem. This ecosystem produced breakthroughs that would later shape global civilization. Algebra, optics, medicine, astronomy, and geography all advanced rapidly during this period. Scholars like Al-Khwarizmi, Ibn Sina, and Al-Farabi did not work in isolation. They were part of a paper-based culture of commentary, critique, and accumulation. Knowledge could now be built layer by layer, generation by generation. Errors could be corrected. Ideas could evolve. This cumulative progress was one of the defining features of the Islamic Golden Age. Meanwhile, Central Asia itself became a bridge rather than a barrier. Cities that once served Chinese or local rulers now became Muslim centers of trade and learning. Turkic peoples, many of whom had fought at Talas or allied with Abbasid forces, gradually converted to Islam over the following centuries. Their integration into the Islamic world would later have enormous consequences, including the rise of powerful Turkic dynasties that ruled from Anatolia to India. Once again, Talas appears less as an isolated event and more as a hinge point in a much larger historical process. What makes this story even more remarkable is how quietly it unfolded. There was no proclamation declaring the age of paper had begun. No grand ceremony marked its adoption. It spread because it worked, because it was practical, because it solved problems that administrators, scholars, and merchants all faced. In that sense, the Battle of Talas was less about victory and defeat and more about exposure. It exposed one civilization to a tool that fundamentally altered how power and knowledge were exercised. As centuries passed, the influence of paper continued to move westward. Through trade and conquest, papermaking reached North Africa and Islamic Spain. From there, it slowly entered Christian Europe. At first, Europeans were skeptical. Parchment had prestige and durability, while paper was seen as fragile and foreign. But economic reality eventually won. Paper was cheaper, it was easier to produce, it supported growing bureaucracies and universities. By the late Middle Ages, paper had become indispensable. This adoption would eventually lead to another transformation: printing. When Gutenberg developed movable type printing in the 15th century, paper was the medium that made mass production of books feasible. Without paper, printing would have remained expensive and limited. And without printing, the Renaissance, the Reformation, and the scientific revolution would have unfolded very differently. Once again, a chain of cause and effect leads back to Central Asia in the 8th century, to a battle few remember by name. Meanwhile, China's relationship with paper followed a different path. Papermaking remained deeply embedded in Chinese culture, supporting civil service examinations, literature, and governance. But China's withdrawal from Central Asia meant that it no longer controlled the main arteries through which its technologies flowed westward. Instead, ideas moved through intermediaries, adapted and transformed along the way. By the time paper returned to East Asia in new forms centuries later, it carried influences shaped by the Islamic and European worlds. The Battle of Talas also challenges the way we think about globalization. Long before the modern era, the world was already interconnected through trade, war, and cultural exchange. Talas shows that globalization does not require intentional coordination. It can emerge from conflict, accident, and unintended consequences. A battlefield decision, a prisoner taken, a technique shared under duress, these can have effects that span continents and centuries. It also reminds us that military history cannot be separated from cultural history. Too often, battles are remembered only in terms of tactics and casualties. But Talas mattered because of what followed, not just what happened on the day of fighting. The armies disbanded, the commanders faded into obscurity, but the ideas unleashed continued to shape human civilization long after the dust settled. There is a deeper irony here. The Tang dynasty, which lost the battle, was one of the most culturally advanced societies of its time. It had already embraced paper, printing techniques like woodblock printing, and a sophisticated bureaucracy. Yet its defeat indirectly enabled these innovations to spread beyond China's borders, influencing societies that would later surpass China in certain domains of science and industry. History, in this sense, does not reward isolation. It rewards exchange, even when that exchange is born from conflict. As the Islamic world flourished, Europe lagged behind, fragmented and comparatively underdeveloped. But when paper and the accumulated knowledge of centuries finally crossed into Europe, the transformation was rapid. Universities emerged, literacy expanded, scientific inquiry accelerated. The modern world began to take shape. And once again, the roots of that transformation can be traced back through Baghdad, Samarkand, and ultimately to the Talas River. The Battle of Talas, therefore, forces us to rethink what it means for a battle to matter. It was not decisive because it destroyed an empire or crowned a king. It was decisive because it changed the medium through which human thought was preserved and shared. It altered the infrastructure of knowledge. And once that infrastructure changed, everything built upon it changed as well. What followed Talas was not a straight line, but a widening circle, from Central Asia to the Middle East, from the Middle East to Europe, from Europe to the rest of the world. Paper became so fundamental to human life that we now take it for granted. Yet its global journey began not in a library or a workshop, but in the aftermath of a battlefield encounter between two empires that never fully understood the legacy they were creating. By the time the armies of the Tang dynasty and the Abbasid Caliphate finally clashed near the Talas River in 751 CE, the battle itself was only the visible surface of something much deeper. What happened on that battlefield was not just a military confrontation. It was the collision of two expanding civilizations, two systems of power, and two different ideas about how the world should be ordered. To understand why Talas mattered so much, we need to look closely at the battle itself, its turning points, and the immediate aftermath that reshaped Central Asia forever. The Tang army that marched west was experienced, disciplined, and confident. Tang forces had been campaigning in Central Asia for decades, securing trade routes, installing friendly rulers, and suppressing revolts. Their soldiers were accustomed to fighting nomadic cavalry, mountain tribes, and urban militias. They relied on a combination of heavy infantry, crossbowmen, and cavalry auxiliaries drawn from allied Turkic tribes. Tang military organization was sophisticated, supported by supply lines, command structures, and a long tradition of imperial warfare. Facing them was the Abbasid army, newly empowered after overthrowing the Umayyad Caliphate just a year earlier. The Abbasids were still consolidating their rule, but they inherited a formidable military tradition from the early Islamic conquests. Their forces were highly mobile, battle-hardened, and skilled in cavalry warfare. Many soldiers came from Khorasan, a region known for producing tough, adaptable fighters. The Abbasids also relied heavily on local allies, Persians, Arabs, and Turkic tribes who saw cooperation with the Caliphate as more beneficial than continued Chinese dominance. The battlefield near the Talas River in present-day Kyrgyzstan was a wide-open area ideal for large-scale maneuvering. For several days, both sides engaged in probing attacks, skirmishes, and tactical positioning. Neither side rushed into a decisive confrontation. Each commander understood that a single mistake could determine not just the battle, but the balance of power in Central Asia. At first, the Tang forces held their ground effectively. Their disciplined formations and ranged weapons inflicted heavy casualties on Abbasid troops. Chinese crossbowmen in particular were deadly, capable of penetrating armor and disrupting cavalry charges. For a time, it seemed possible that the Tang might once again assert their dominance and push the Islamic world back toward the west. But the battle turned on one critical factor: the loyalty of the Karluk Turks. The Karluks were a powerful Turkic tribe allied with the Tang army. They had been incorporated into China's frontier system, receiving titles, trade privileges, and autonomy in exchange for military support. However, their loyalty was pragmatic, not ideological. They watched the battle carefully, weighing which side would offer them a better future. At a decisive moment, the Karluks switched sides. Whether this was prearranged with the Abbasids or a spontaneous decision remains debated by historians. What is clear is that their sudden attack on the Tang rear shattered the Chinese battle line. Caught between Abbasid forces in front and Karluk cavalry behind, the Tang army fell into chaos. Formations broke, command and control collapsed. What had been an organized retreat quickly turned into a rout. The defeat was devastating. Tang General Gao Xianzi managed to escape with a portion of his forces, but the army was effectively destroyed. Thousands were killed or captured. The Chinese military presence in Central Asia, built over decades, evaporated almost overnight. More importantly, the psychological impact of the defeat was enormous. For the first time in generations, the Tang dynasty had suffered a clear and decisive loss to a foreign power far from its core territory. For the Abbasids, Talas was a strategic victory rather than a conquest. They did not march east to seize Chinese lands, nor did they attempt to occupy the Tarim Basin. Instead, they secured what mattered most: influence. Central Asia gradually shifted into the Islamic world's political, economic, and cultural orbit. Trade routes realigned. Local rulers recalculated their loyalties. The balance of power tipped westward. Yet the most famous consequence of Talas did not involve territory or armies. It involved knowledge. Among the Chinese prisoners taken by the Abbasids were artisans skilled in papermaking. Paper had been invented in China centuries earlier and was already replacing bamboo slips and silk as the primary writing material. Lightweight, inexpensive, and practical, paper was one of China's greatest technological advantages. Until Thales, paper-making techniques had been closely guarded secrets. In the Abbasid world, these techniques found fertile ground. Within a few decades, paper mills appeared in Samarkand, then Baghdad. From there, paper spread across the Islamic world to Damascus, Cairo, and Cordoba. The impact was revolutionary. Compared to parchment or papyrus, paper was cheaper and easier to produce in large quantities. This dramatically increased literacy, record-keeping, scholarship, and administration. The Abbasid Golden Age flourished on paper. Scientific treatises, philosophical works, medical manuals, and translations of Greek, Persian, and Indian texts could now be copied and circulated widely. Libraries expanded, bureaucracies became more efficient, contracts, letters, and books became part of everyday life in a way never seen before. The Islamic world became the global center of learning, preserving and expanding knowledge that would later reach Europe. Ironically, China itself did not immediately feel the loss of paper-making exclusivity. The Tang dynasty soon faced much greater problems closer to home. Just a few years after Thales, the An-Lushan Rebellion erupted, one of the most devastating civil wars in human history. Millions died, the economy collapsed, and the Tang state never fully recovered. Compared to this internal catastrophe, the loss of influence in Central Asia seemed almost secondary. This is why Thales faded from Chinese historical memory. It was overshadowed by internal collapse rather than celebrated or mourned as a defining moment. In the Islamic world, however, Thales came to be seen as a symbolic victory, proof that the caliphate could stand against one of the world's greatest empires and prevail. It marked the eastern limit of Islamic military expansion and the beginning of a long period of cultural dominance in Central Asia. By the end of the 8th century, the region between China and the Middle East had fundamentally changed. Buddhism declined as Islam spread. Chinese administrative influence weakened. Persian and Arabic languages gained prominence. Trade continued, but now under a different cultural framework. The Battle of Thales ended in 751 CE with dust settling over a quiet river valley in Central Asia, but its true consequences were only beginning. Long after the soldiers had marched away and the political lines had shifted, the most powerful legacy of Thales continued to travel, slowly, steadily, and almost invisibly across continents. That legacy was paper, and through it, the spread of knowledge that reshaped civilizations. After paper-making reached Samarkand, the Abbasid Caliphate quickly recognized its value. Samarkand was already a major hub on the Silk Road, connecting China, India, Persia, and the Middle East. By the late 8th century, paper production had become organized and standardized. Unlike parchment, which required animal skins, or papyrus, which depended on a specific plant grown mainly in Egypt, paper could be made from a wide range of materials: linen rags, hemp, and plant fibers. This flexibility made it ideal for mass use. From Samarkand, paper-making spread to Baghdad, the new Abbasid capital. This was a critical moment. Baghdad was not just a political center, it was an intellectual one. The Abbasid caliphs actively sponsored learning, translation, and scholarship. Paper arrived at exactly the right time. The House of Wisdom, Baghdad's legendary center of learning, depended on paper to translate and preserve works of Greek philosophy, Roman science, Persian administration, and Indian mathematics. Without paper, this explosion of knowledge would have been impossible. Books became cheaper to produce. Scholars could copy texts more easily. Students could take notes. Governments could keep detailed records. Legal systems became more sophisticated. Commerce expanded through written contracts and accounting. In effect, paper became the infrastructure of civilization, supporting everything from science to state power. As the Islamic world thrived, paper continued its westward journey. By the 10th century, papermaking had reached North Africa. By the 11th and 12th centuries, it entered Europe through Islamic Spain and Sicily. At first, Europeans were slow to adopt it. Many Christian authorities distrusted paper because it was associated with the Islamic world, preferring parchment for religious texts. But economics eventually won. Paper was simply too practical to ignore. By the 13th century, paper mills were operating in Italy, especially in places like Fabriano. European papermakers improved production techniques, adding water-powered mills and better pressing methods. Costs dropped further, availability increased, and with that, Europe quietly entered a new phase of intellectual life. The timing was crucial. When Johannes Gutenberg invented the movable type printing press in the mid-15th century, paper was already widely available. Printing on parchment would have been prohibitively expensive. Printing on paper made mass communication possible. Books could be produced in the thousands instead of the dozens. Literacy spread beyond monasteries and elites. Ideas could move faster than ever before. The Renaissance, the Reformation, and the scientific revolution all depended on paper. Martin Luther's theses spread rapidly because they were printed on paper. Scientific journals emerged because paper allowed researchers to share findings. Political pamphlets fueled revolutions. Legal systems became more standardized. Education expanded. All of this traced its material foundation back, in part, to the transmission of papermaking techniques after Talas. This is why the Battle of Talas matters far beyond its military context. It was not a world-changing battle because of territory gained or lost. It was world-changing because it shifted the flow of knowledge. Unlike battles that redraw borders, Talas altered how human societies stored, shared, and built upon ideas. It also represents a broader historical truth. Progress often spreads through unintended consequences. The Abbasids did not fight the Tang dynasty to acquire papermaking secrets. The Tang did not lose Talas knowing that it would one day influence European universities or modern democracy. History moved forward through chance, interaction, and exchange. From a global perspective, Talas symbolizes the interconnectedness of civilizations. Chinese innovation, Islamic scholarship, and European adaptation all formed a continuous chain. No single culture owned the outcome. Each played a role, each benefited in different ways. Even today, in the digital age, we are still living in a world shaped by paper. Laws, books, education systems, and bureaucracies evolved around it. Although screens have replaced pages in many areas, the structures built on written knowledge remain. And all of it leads back to a forgotten battlefield near a river most people have never heard of. The Battle of Talas reminds us that history's most important moments are not always the loudest. Sometimes they happen quietly on the margins of empires, where soldiers clash, but ideas escape. In 751 CE, armies fought for control of Central Asia. What the world gained instead was something far more powerful, a medium that allowed human knowledge to spread, accumulate, and endure. That is why Talas was not just a battle. It was a turning point in how civilization itself moved forward.